Today we're talking about frying pans. There are a few things in my kitchen that I love more than my fancy Japanese knives, but my frying pans might just qualify. I'm a big fan of both the old-fashioned cast iron and the carbon steel frying pan, and these guys have gotten really popular in the last few years, especially the cast iron. People like, their old school aesthetic. I think they like the fact that there's no Teflon, so they're not going to kill you. People say cast iron can be good for your health. There's lots of claims, but they just rock to cook in. So today we're going to talk about the differences between these two similar looking but very different types of pans, what each one's good for and which one you need. Hint, the answer is both. So these pans actually have more in common than you might think. They're made from very similar materials. Carbon steel is primarily iron with a tiny little bit of carbon in it, and that allows it to be hammered out nice and thin, lightweight. It's a great material. Cast iron, on the other hand, despite the name, is a very similar material. There's just a little more carbon in it, which tends to make it more brittle, so the pans tend to be thicker and heavier. So today we're going to compare a Smithy cast iron pan that's made in the USA and a Kirameki carbon steel pan that's made in Japan. Let's talk about the similarities first. They're made from pretty similar materials. Carbon steel has its iron with a little bit of carbon in it, whereas cast iron is very similar, it's just got a bit more carbon. We'll talk about how that makes them different in a minute. Both materials handle high heat very well, so they're great for stir frying and searing, that kind of thing. Anytime you need a really hot pan, these guys are gonna be happy. You can also cook with both of these on pretty much any kind of stove. Gas, electric, induction, you can put them in the oven, you can put them over a fire. They're extremely versatile. They're both magnetic, so they both work on induction. You can also do almost any kind of cooking method with both of them. You can do searing, sauteing, stir frying, shallow frying, deep frying. You can braise, you can bake a pie in both of these. So they are extremely versatile, which is another huge benefit of both types. Now, both of these, because they have a high iron content, can rust, which means they require seasoning both to prevent rust, but also to make them non-stick. So yes, these pans are non-stick, but not in the way that you think of a Teflon pan being non-stick. It's not a coating added in the factory. When they make them, they grind them down, make them super smooth, and then you season them with oil, which helps to prevent food from sticking to them. And if you get the seasoning right, they're perfectly non-stick. Both also clean very easily, especially if they've been seasoned properly. If the pan is seasoned, often burnt stuff will just slide right off, especially with a bit of hot water, but you can use a pan scraper or a Tawashi brush or even like a chainmail scrubby, and that'll knock anything off of these. If you've just made eggs or you just sauteed something, chances are you don't even need to scrub the pan and the food will just wipe right out. It's pretty awesome. If the pan's not seasoned so well, stuff can get burned on there a little more, but it's still quite easy to scrape it off, again with a plastic scraper or with some kosher salt. Now the differences is what we're really interested in today. Because of the higher carbon content, cast iron is much more brittle, so they have to make the pan much thicker, which makes it much heavier, and also really changes the cooking properties, something we'll get into in a sec. Carbon steel is much more flexible and much tougher, so they can make the pans way thinner, way more lightweight, which makes them a lot better for like tossing and sauteing. You don't really want to toss and saute with a cast iron pan unless you're looking for like a serious workout. Cast iron is a fairly poor conductor, so it's going to heat up and cool down quite slowly, but that gives it excellent heat retention. Carbon steel heats up and cools down much more quickly. Cast iron can get hot spots in the pan, so you want to heat it more slowly to get a more even heat, but it's an amazing regulator. Between the regulation and the heat retention, it won't spike or drop in temperature very easily compared to a thinner pan like a carbon steel pan. Cast iron's high heat capacity helps it maintain a really steady heat, so when you drop something cold into the pan, the temperature doesn't drop off, and that makes it the undisputed king of searing. It also has a high heat emissivity, and basically what that means is from the surface of the pan, compared to other pans, it radiates heat further away from the surface, more than just a millimeter, actually several millimeters. And so that means when you're cooking, again, a steak, for example, it's gonna cook that steak through more evenly, so you're not gonna end up with a seared outside and a raw inside. It's gonna be more consistently cooked all the way through. Cheaper cast iron can be really rough on the surface, and that can make it bad for cooking things like eggs because it makes it more sticky. However, if you get a better cast iron like the Smithy that's been machined out, they're going to be amazing for eggs, just as good as carbon steel or non-stick. And lastly, like I said, both these pans require seasoning, but with cast iron, the oil actually polymerizes to the surface of the pan, which makes it much more durable and much more long lasting, whereas carbon steel, it's more of a superficial layer on the steel, and so you need to reseason season them a little more often. I tend to oil them out after every time I cook, just to make sure the seasoning stays perfect. So which one is best? I use both, and you should probably have both. I use my cast iron for searing, like steaks, I said earlier, but also for long, slow cooks where consistency and time is key. Think deep frying and braising. Carbon steel, by comparison, I tend to use for more quick cooks where I need really intense heat really fast, so stir fries and sautés, that kind of thing. But it's also great for searing if you're doing something smaller, like a piece of fish that isn't going to cool the pan down as much, or if you're doing something where you want to bring the temperature up slowly, like crisping up the skin on a piece of duck breast or a chicken breast. Both of these pans are great for that kind of searing. But enough talk, let's get to cooking. So with both kinds of pans, preheating is very important. You want to heat the pan slowly over a medium-low heat for 5 to 10 minutes. It's going to help the whole pan heat up evenly, especially with cast iron. It's also going to prevent any kind of warping from having different parts of the metal heating up at different rates, and that's why you don't want to put your pans right onto a hot stove or heat them up too quickly at too high of a heat. So again, medium-low, 5 or 10 minutes, let them get nice and hot, and then crank them to your desired temperature and get cooking. So I've had this cast iron going for about 10 minutes on my desired temperature. I'm going to crank it up to about medium. My stove's pretty hot, and so that's where I'm going to sear my steak at. I give it another 30 seconds to just really come up to that threshold, and this preheat is really going to help lock in the sear on the steak. All right, my steak's ready for the pan. I'm just going to add a little bit of oil there. You always want to add your oil after you preheat the pan, and then we're going to make sure that that gets nice and hot. Even cast iron pans with longer handles, the handles tend to get quite hot, so I always just keep a towel or an oven mitt handy so I can handle the pan as needed. All right, now that it's hot, I can get to searing. So while that steak sears, let's have a little science guy moment. The reason that preheating is so important and the reason cast iron is so good at searing is because of that heat retention and that preheat. Because the pan's nice and hot and because it retains heat so well, when I put a cold steak into that pan, it's going to drop the temperature of the pan a little bit, but it's going to recover very quickly. It's not really going to fluctuate too much, which is what we want. We want a nice consistent high heat so we can get that nice sear. In an improperly preheated pan, or a pan with bad heat retention, like a thinner pan, that temperature is going to drop a lot more. And that's bad, because when the pan's hot enough, water coming out of the steak will evaporate right away. But when the pan's cold, water coming out of the steak is more so going to boil. It's not going to evaporate right away. It's going to start bubbling, and you're going to end up basically boiling your steak as opposed to searing it. Water is the enemy of browning. Water happens at about 100 degrees Celsius. Browning on meat happens way above that, so you need to remove any water as much as possible to get a good sear. So, good pan with heat retention and preheat, you've got a nice sear, nice consistent heat all the way through. Pan that's not preheated properly, doesn't have good heat retention, the temperature is going to drop off, it's going to recover very slowly, and by the time that steak starts searing and all that moisture is gone, your steak's fully cooked and it's just going to be terrible. So if you don't preheat your pan properly, you're better off just pulling the steak and starting again. So remember, always preheat your pans and use cast iron to sear your steak. Let's see if it's ready to flip now. Just gonna take a little peek. So there's lots of opinions about how many times you should flip your steak, whether you should only flip it once or several times throughout the process, or how long you should cook it for a perfect cook. I'm fine with having a steak that's a little more in the medium category, because if you rest it properly and you get a great sear, it's going to be delicious anyways. So I'm focused really on getting a great sear here. While my steak's searing, I've got my carbon steel pan preheating because it also needs 5 or 10 minutes to preheat. Yet another reason why cast iron is so great for searing steak is if you want to do a butter baste. Because it retains heat so well, you can tip that pan off the heat, and even if you have an electric stove where it doesn't contact the pan anymore, that pan's still going to stay searing hot while you're basting your steak. So when you put it back down, it's going to bring heat back from the stove, but you don't really need to worry about it too much because that pan's going to stay hot for so long. So my carbon steel pans had about 5 minutes to preheat over a low heat. It's starting to get a little smoky now. A lot of people will preheat the pan to the point where you throw water in and it kind of like evaporates really quick. The mercury stage is where you chuck water in and it actually gets into these little droplets that run around the pan. That's a sign that your pan's hot enough. So now we're gonna crank it up to our sauteing heat, about medium or so. Now that the pan's properly preheated, we're gonna throw a little bit of oil in there. Work that around our pan. We're gonna saute our vegetables. First. Whoop. When it comes to the difference between cast iron and carbon steel, it's like 50-50. They're similar in a lot of ways and they're different in a lot of ways. At the end of the day, you can do pretty much everything with both, but they are, you know, better for certain jobs. This is better for searing, braising, that kind of thing. This is better for the hot and fast stuff. So I recommend having at least one of each. I have a collection of cast iron and it continues to grow, and I've got a couple of carbon steel woks up there and a couple of carbon steel pans. At the end of the day, if you had one of each, you would be set. Like, you would be good for most of the cooking that most people are going to do at home. And I hope you end up getting both because they're both pretty cool. Cast iron, I recommend grabbing something big like a 12-inch. Carbon steel, maybe something a little smaller, a little lighter. You don't necessarily need a full 12-inch if you're just sauteing, so maybe like a 10-inch is probably good, and maybe get an 8-inch of either as your third pan for doing eggs and that kind of thing, grilled cheese, you know. If you have a preferred type of pan, leave them in the comments below. If you are an actual chef and you want to roast my plating technique, please do. But I'm pretty proud of it. And I'm gonna eat some lunch now. This steak turned out pretty good. This is a nice like fire roasted salsa that I made last week with fresh tomatoes from my garden. God damn. Yep, pretty good. Awesome. Subscribe. Stay tuned for more videos. Have a good day.